A black woman was pulled over by an officer. When asked to step out, she simply asked, "Am I being detained?" What followed exposed more than bias. It showed how silence can speak volumes. The situation wasn't about loud complaints or angry confrontations. It was about the unnoticed moments, the subtle cues that can change everything. And it was the silence, captured in a brief but telling video, that revealed more than words ever could. The video, lasting just over 3 minutes, quickly went viral, sparking nationwide discussions and forcing an airline to face uncomfortable truths about bias and respect. Why did this seemingly small oversight ignite such a storm? How did a man, who spoke almost nothing during the ordeal, end up reshaping the conversation around respect, assumptions, and dignity? Watch this story unfold. It might make you rethink the way you see everyday moments and the power of silence in changing perceptions. The road was quiet as Gloria Hemmings made her way home. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep shade of violet. As she drove through the winding roads of Georgia, there was a peacefulness that came with the end of another long day. The sounds of nature surrounded her, the gentle rustling of leaves, the faint chirping of crickets, and the hum of her car's engine. She had just left her sister-in-law Bernice's house, a visit that had been pleasant but tiring. The last few years had taken their toll on her. Since Marvin passed, Gloria often felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Driving down these familiar roads, though, she found solace. It was the one time she could let her mind wander, reflect, or sometimes not think at all. On the passenger seat beside her sat a Tupperware container of peach cobbler. Bernice had insisted she take it home, telling her, "You're getting too skinny. You need to eat." Gloria smiled to herself, remembering the look of concern on Bernice's face. She hadn't had much of an appetite lately, but she wasn't about to argue with her sister-in-law. Not tonight. Not when there was such a deep sense of peace in the air. But just as the road stretched ahead, a flicker of red and blue flashed in her rearview mirror. The peaceful moment was suddenly shattered, and Gloria's heart skipped a beat. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. The flashing lights, though routine, had a way of making anyone feel uneasy. Gloria wasn't worried. After all, she had done nothing wrong, but years of experience had taught her to stay alert. She signaled and eased her old sedan over to the side of the road. As she pulled over, Gloria kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, as she always did. No sudden movements. She had learned the hard way that these moments, seemingly mundane, could turn into something more. She had seen it happen to others, and she knew it could happen to her. But she wasn't about to let fear take control. She wasn't afraid of what was about to happen. She was in control. The officer's car stopped behind her, and for a moment, all was still. Gloria glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the officer stepping out of his vehicle. He was young, probably in his 30s, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Gloria exhaled slowly. She wasn't nervous. She was just tired. Tired of the constant scrutiny. Tired of the assumptions. Tired of feeling like she had to prove herself to people who didn't know her, who didn't know the weight of her life. The officer's boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way to her car. She could feel his eyes on her through the side mirror. His posture was rigid, his hands resting on his belt. He was sizing her up, but she wasn't about to make it easy for him. She already knew how this was going to go. The officer reached her window and knocked lightly on the glass. Gloria rolled it down slowly. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm. He looked her over quickly. His eyes didn't meet hers for long, instead scanning her face and the inside of the car, his posture never relaxing. "License and registration, please." Gloria didn't hesitate. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" The officer's eyes flickered to hers for a moment before shifting back down to his clipboard. He didn't respond right away, but the silence between them was thick, loaded with unspoken assumptions. "You swerved back there," he said after a pause, pointing vaguely to the stretch of road behind them. "You been drinking tonight?" Gloria blinked. She didn't have to think about her response. She hadn't had a drink in over 20 years, but that wasn't the point. The point was that he hadn't even bothered to explain why he had pulled her over or ask any relevant questions. He had already decided. "No, sir," Gloria replied, her voice calm but firm. "I haven't had a drink in years." The officer glanced at her for a moment, his face unreadable. He looked at her hands on the wheel, then at her face again. His gaze was a little colder now, more judgmental. "Do you have any weapons or controlled substances in the vehicle?" "No, sir." The officer stepped back, but only slightly, as if unsure whether to trust her. He looked at her again, like he was searching for something, trying to read her in a way that only someone who had been trained to do so could. He was looking for a reason to escalate, a reason to feel justified. His hand hovered near his holster, his fingers twitching just enough for Gloria to notice. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his voice growing a little sharper now, more authoritative. Gloria didn't flinch. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. "Am I being detained?" she asked calmly, her voice even, but there was a quiet strength behind her words. The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his tone no longer questioning, but demanding. Gloria remained still for a moment. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, waiting for her to comply. But Gloria wasn't about to comply with an officer who hadn't even told her why she was being stopped in the first place. She was a black woman, older than most drivers, but that didn't mean she should be treated with any less respect. She knew the game they played, the assumptions, the way they sized her up based on her age, her skin color, and her car. But she wasn't going to play along. "Officer," she said, her voice still calm, "I have identification. May I show it to you?" The officer's eyes narrowed as he stood back, his hand still hovering near his gun. He clearly wasn't used to anyone questioning him. "I said step out of the vehicle." Gloria didn't move. Instead, she reached slowly for her purse. The officer tensed, but Gloria kept her movements deliberate, slow, controlled. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She wasn't going to do anything that would make him feel threatened. "Officer, I'm not reaching for anything," she said softly. "My ID is in my purse. I'll show it to you." There was a brief pause, the air between them thick with tension. Then, with a smooth motion, Gloria opened her purse and pulled out her Supreme Court credentials. She handed them to the officer, her expression unchanging. "I'm Associate Justice Gloria Hemmings," she said, her voice still steady, but the weight of her words was undeniable. The officer froze. His eyes flickered from the credentials to her face, then back to the credentials. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The bravado he had walked up to her with was now gone. The tension in the air wasn't just from their disagreement, it was from the shock, the realization that he had assumed so much and was now standing before someone far more important than he could have ever known. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed the quiet Georgia road in golden light as Gloria Hemmings drove home. The roads were empty, save for the occasional silhouette of a car in the distance. She always enjoyed these drives, the peaceful hum of her old sedan and the gentle whoosh of the tires against the asphalt. There was a comfort in this quiet solitude, a reminder that life could still be simple despite the years of hardship she had endured. At 73, Gloria had long ago made peace with the loss of her husband Marvin. It had been 5 years, but the memories of him, his quiet strength, his wisdom, still filled every corner of her life. Tonight she had just visited Bernice, her sister-in-law, who never failed to remind her that she needed to eat more. The peach cobbler on the passenger seat was her gift for the evening. Gloria smiled faintly, not particularly hungry, but she wouldn't refuse Bernice's thoughtful gesture. Not tonight. She had been driving for over an hour, her mind wandering between thoughts of her family, her work, and the quiet sadness that came with living alone. The road ahead stretched long and empty, and the quiet was comforting, until the flashing lights of a police cruiser broke through the stillness. Gloria's hands tightened around the wheel, her calm demeanor not faltering, but the familiar tension of a traffic stop seeped into her bones. She signaled to the side of the road, bringing her car to a smooth stop. Her heart rate picked up, but only slightly. Gloria had been pulled over more times than she cared to admit. She knew the drill. Keep your hands visible. Stay polite. No sudden movements. She had learned the rules long ago. Not that it made it any easier, especially when she knew what was coming. The police car pulled up behind her, the blue and red lights flashing in her mirrors. Gloria glanced in her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the officer as he got out of his vehicle. He was young, maybe in his 30s, with a buzz cut and a rigid posture that suggested he saw himself as a man of authority. He approached her vehicle with a certain level of confidence that was often seen in younger officers still eager to prove themselves. She rolled down her window, her hands placed carefully at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Her face was composed, calm. She wasn't nervous, not yet. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said, his tone polite but neutral. He looked her over, scanning her face quickly before glancing down at her car. "License and registration, please." Gloria didn't hesitate. She pulled her registration from the glove compartment and handed it to him, her movements deliberate and measured. There was a slight pause as the officer looked at the documents. He shifted his weight slightly, his eyes now focused on her. "I noticed you swerved back there. You've been drinking tonight?" he asked, his voice carrying just a hint of suspicion. Gloria blinked. She was taken aback. "No, officer. I haven't had a drink in over 20 years." The officer paused for a moment, clearly sizing her up. He seemed to take in her age and her car, an older model, and the assumptions began to form in his mind. She was an elderly woman, driving alone in a modest vehicle. He didn't expect her to be anyone of importance, and in that brief moment, the weight of his assumptions settled in. She could see it in his eyes, the subtle shift, the underlying judgment. His posture, too, had changed. He was no longer standing with the same relaxed confidence as before. There was something colder now, something that made her feel like she was no longer just a person to him, but a target for his scrutiny. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone shifting from polite to more insistent. Gloria's grip on the steering wheel tightened just a fraction, but she kept her voice steady. "Am I being detained?" The officer didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to the side, his hand resting near his weapon as he waited for her to make a move. He clearly expected her to comply without question. "I said step out of the car," he repeated, a little more forcefully this time. Gloria's gaze never wavered. She didn't flinch, didn't show any signs of fear or anger. She simply asked, "May I ask why I'm being detained?" The officer hesitated for a moment. "It's routine," he replied, though his words were thin, barely masking his irritation. "You swerved, and I need to check if you're fit to drive." Gloria didn't move. She didn't raise her voice or argue. Instead, she remained calm, but there was a quiet power in her posture now, a subtle reminder that she was in control of the situation, not him. "I'm not sure why that's necessary, officer," she said, her voice still calm but with an edge that made the officer pause. "I have nothing to hide." The officer stood there for a moment, his hand still resting near his holster. Gloria kept her hands visible, her eyes steady, not letting his judgment rattle her. She had been through this before, and it wasn't the first time someone had tried to intimidate her. Not the first time she'd been looked down on because of her age or the color of her skin. But this time, she wasn't going to back down. She knew what he was thinking. An older black woman, alone at night, probably on her way to some small house on the outskirts of town. She didn't fit the profile of someone who should be respected. She was the kind of person he had been taught to treat as a nuisance. Gloria reached for her purse and the officer's body stiffened, his hand twitching toward his weapon. "Don't reach for anything," he barked, his voice tight with the authority he believed he had over her. She didn't flinch. "I'm not reaching for anything, officer," she said evenly. "I'm only reaching for my identification." She took her time, pulling out her wallet and removing a small leather card. She held it out in front of him, letting him see it clearly. "I'm Associate Justice Gloria Hemmings," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm with the Supreme Court of the United States." The officer blinked, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes dropped to the credentials, then slowly raised to meet her gaze. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His entire demeanor shifted from the practiced confidence of an officer to something more akin to confusion and embarrassment. He looked at the card again, as though making sure he wasn't seeing things. Gloria didn't move. She kept her gaze steady on him, waiting for him to process it all. The officer blinked, still holding Gloria's credentials in his hand, as if trying to process the fact that he had just pulled over someone of such importance. His grip tightened around the leather card, and for a moment, his entire body seemed frozen in place. Gloria's calm, steady gaze never wavered as she waited for him to speak, to apologize, to acknowledge his mistake. But the silence between them grew longer, thick with tension. The officer opened his mouth, trying to formulate words, but nothing came out. His lips parted, then closed. He glanced down at the credentials again, as if reassured by their presence, but his thoughts were clearly racing. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in, and he was unsure how to handle it. I didn't know," he said finally, his voice faltering. His gaze remained fixed on her credentials, avoiding her eyes. His posture was no longer confident. Now it was stiff, uncertain. Gloria could almost hear the internal struggle in his mind. He had assumed she was just another elderly woman, vulnerable and inconsequential, and now he was faced with someone far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Gloria didn't respond right away. She let him stew in his own shame, knowing the lesson was in the silence. There was no need for her to raise her voice, to scold him. The lesson was already being taught. His assumption was clear, and the way his shoulders sagged told her everything she needed to know. He was embarrassed. He was realizing just how wrong he had been. I should have." The officer stammered again, his words lost in a sea of apology and confusion. He hadn't expected to be caught in a situation like this. He had no idea who she was, but he had acted like he did. Now, he was on the wrong side of the law, not because of anything she had done, but because of his own actions, his prejudice, his assumptions. "Is that what you were taught to do, officer?" Gloria finally asked, her voice breaking the silence with its calm authority. "To treat people based on the color of their skin or their age? To decide who deserves respect before you even know who they are?" The officer's face flushed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked down again, avoiding her gaze. His eyes were filled with a mixture of regret and confusion, and for a moment, Gloria could see him wrestling with himself. He had always been the one in control, the one with the badge, but now that power seemed like nothing more than a piece of metal on his chest. "I didn't mean it like that," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just doing my job." Gloria's eyes narrowed slightly. She could see the shame creeping into his features. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being confronted by someone who wouldn't back down, someone who refused to let him get away with his mistake. She could tell he was trying to backtrack, trying to justify his actions, but the damage had already been done. "Your job is not to judge, officer," Gloria said, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "Your job is to serve, to protect. And that means treating every citizen with respect, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, no matter what they look like." The officer swallowed hard. He took a small step back, his hand still gripping her credentials, but his body language had shifted. The confidence he once had was replaced with an awkward uncertainty. Gloria had seen this before. People who believed they were in control until they realized they weren't, until they realized that assumptions and biases could come crashing down with a single moment of truth. I didn't think, I mean, he trailed off again, words failing him as he glanced at her, then quickly looked away. "I'm sorry," he said finally, almost as if the apology was automatic, something he had been trained to say in situations like this. Gloria nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need him to grovel. She had lived long enough to know that true change didn't come from empty words. It came from actions, from learning, from recognizing when you've made a mistake and owning it. But she wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "You're sorry now," she said, her voice quieter but firm. "But you need to understand something. It's not just about being sorry. It's about doing better. It's about recognizing that every single person you encounter has a right to be treated with dignity. And when you don't do that, when you make assumptions based on appearances or stereotypes, you fail to do your job." The officer shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Gloria wasn't finished, though. "I'm not angry with you, officer," she said, her tone softening just a little. "I'm disappointed. Disappointed that you let your biases shape how you treated me. Disappointed that you didn't see me as a person first, but as something you needed to control." There was a long pause. The officer looked at her credentials again, his eyes flicking from the card to her face, trying to make sense of it all. He had assumed, and in doing so, he had been forced to confront his own shortcomings. Gloria hadn't raised her voice, hadn't shouted, but her words had struck deep. She gave him a moment to absorb it, but the silence was growing heavier, and she knew it was time to move on. "I'm going to drive home now," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable finality. "I suggest you think long and hard about what happened here, because you have a duty to treat every person with respect, and that includes people like me." The officer didn't say anything. He simply stood there, holding her credentials, looking at her as if he were waiting for something more. But there was nothing more to say. The lesson had been delivered, and it was up to him to internalize it. Gloria gave him one last look before she climbed back into her car, slowly starting the engine. She didn't look back as she pulled away, but she knew he would be standing there for a while, processing everything. The officer had learned a lesson in humility, one that would stay with him long after this night had passed. As Gloria's car slowly pulled away from the shoulder, the faint hum of the engine filled the silence between her and the officer. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel lightly as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The officer was still standing there, his head slightly tilted, looking down at her credentials like they held the key to some vast mystery. She wasn't sure what exactly he was thinking, but she had a feeling he wouldn't forget this encounter anytime soon. She didn't feel anger as she drove, not even frustration. What she felt was something deeper, something quieter. She had lived long enough to understand that these moments, these small, fleeting interactions, could sometimes be the most important. And this moment, though it seemed insignificant to the officer at first, was one of those rare occasions where a lesson in humility could make all the difference. But the world didn't always work that way, did it? As the road stretched before her, she continued to think about the officer. He had made his assumptions, acted on them, and then stood before her, humbled by the truth. But there was no instant fix for that kind of behavior. It took time. It took effort. He had to truly understand why his assumptions were wrong, and that wasn't something she could teach him in one simple conversation. But maybe, just maybe, she had planted a seed. She wasn't naive enough to believe one moment could change a person's worldview, but she knew something important. Sometimes, all it took was a shift in perspective, a single moment of clarity to alter the way someone saw the world. And today, for the officer, that moment had arrived. The feeling that something wasn't quite over. She knew she had been calm, even patient with the officer, but the lesson hadn't been fully delivered. Not yet. The sudden sound of a car door slamming behind her caught her attention. She glanced in her rearview mirror once more, expecting to see the officer still standing by his cruiser. But what she saw instead made her heart skip a beat. The officer was now walking toward her car. He was no longer in a hurry, but there was something different in his step, something slow, measured, as though he had a decision to make. She rolled down her window just slightly, keeping her gaze steady ahead. As he approached, he hesitated, looking at her for a moment, as if unsure how to begin. Gloria didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply waited. I'm sorry, ma'am, the officer said, his voice quieter now, more sincere. He had stopped just a few feet from her car, standing with his hands clasped in front of him, his shoulders slightly hunched. I didn't mean to disrespect you. Gloria remained still, her expression unchanged. She had heard apologies before, many times, but they were rarely ever genuine. It was the kind of apology that came with an expectation of being forgiven quickly, brushed aside. She wouldn't make it easy for him. I know I made a mistake, he continued, his voice low, almost apologetic, but still edged with that hint of uncertainty. I shouldn't have assumed anything about you. I was wrong, and I need to be better. Gloria listened closely, taking in the weight of his words. His voice lacked the bravado he had once carried, the sense of authority that had come from a place of judgment. Now there was only humility. She knew it was hard for him to admit his mistake, but the apology, though simple, was what mattered most. She nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. It's easy to make assumptions, officer, but assumptions don't always lead to the truth. And when you treat someone as less than because of their appearance, you not only diminish them, you diminish yourself. The officer looked down at the ground for a moment, then nodded. I get it now. I was wrong, and I'll do better. There was a sincerity in his voice now that hadn't been there before. The kind of sincerity that spoke not just of regret, but of a desire to grow, to change. He wasn't just saying the words because it was expected. He was saying them because he knew, deep down, that this moment mattered. Gloria didn't offer him a smile, but the faintest nod was all the approval he needed. She had said her piece, and the apology, though simple, was enough for her. She didn't need any more words. She didn't need him to grovel. She didn't even need him to apologize in the first place. What mattered was that he had recognized the mistake, and that was a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. You're free to go, Gloria said, her voice calm, but the finality of her words rang through the air. The officer stood there for a moment, still holding his ground. Then, as if coming to terms with the situation, he nodded again, more firmly this time, and turned to walk back to his cruiser. The hum of the engine filled the air as he started the car, the flashing lights now turned off. Gloria watched him leave through her rearview mirror. There were no words left to say. He had learned what he needed to learn, and she had done her part, quietly and without fanfare. As she drove away, the road once again felt calm, empty, and peaceful. The lesson had been delivered, and the officer would carry it with him from this day forward. Gloria didn't need anything more from him. She had her own peace to return to. The world wasn't perfect, and she knew there were still people out there who would make assumptions about her and others. But if she could shift even one perspective, then it had all been worth it. Gloria's car continued to roll down the empty stretch of road, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt, the only sound in the otherwise quiet night. The weight of the evening's events lingered, but not in a way that felt heavy or burdensome. It was more of a quiet resolution, a sense of completion. The officer's apology, though brief, had been sincere, and that was enough for her. She hadn't needed him to grovel. She hadn't expected a grand gesture. What mattered was that he had learned something. His assumptions about her, his judgment, had been shattered. And for the first time in what had likely been a long while, he would question his own biases before pulling someone over again. Gloria had always believed that true change came not from confrontation, but from showing the world the power of quiet dignity. Tonight, she had done that. Without shouting, without anger, without force. She had simply spoken the truth, calmly and firmly, and let the power of that truth do the rest. It was enough. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she reflected on the road that had led her here. She had spent her life navigating roads that weren't always kind, facing battles that weren't always visible. She had been underestimated time and time again, first by society, then by her peers, and in the case of tonight, by an officer who had assumed she was just another elderly woman to push around. But what people often forgot was that the most powerful weapons didn't come in the form of force or position. They came in the form of resilience, grace, and unwavering respect for oneself and others. Gloria had been fighting for respect her entire life, and tonight she had reminded someone else of its value. It wasn't about proving herself. It was about holding herself to a higher standard and showing others what that looked like. The road ahead seemed endless, but there was something soothing about its stretch. The darkness outside was peaceful, a perfect contrast to the internal shift that had taken place in her. Her work, her life, had always been about justice. And even though she had been retired for a while, tonight had reminded her that justice wasn't just a legal term. It was something that lived in every moment, in every interaction. The officer, in his quiet apology, had learned that lesson. He wouldn't forget the woman who had calmly handed him her credentials and delivered a lesson in humanity. He would remember her face, the dignity she carried with her, and the way he had been forced to confront his own assumptions. That kind of lesson stayed with you. It changed the way you saw the world. And Gloria knew he wouldn't be the same officer tomorrow. He would do his job with more care, more awareness. He would remember the lessons she had taught him. As Gloria's car moved on, she felt the weight of the evening start to lift. The hard, sharp edges of the interaction had faded into the background. The world outside her window seemed softer now, as if it too had absorbed the lessons of the night. The highway stretched ahead, its pale yellow lines flickering under the glow of her headlights. There was nothing but her and the road. And for the first time in a long while she felt a sense of peace, not because the world was perfect, but because she knew she had done her part. She had taken a moment that could have been filled with anger, with frustration, with division, and turned it into a lesson in respect, in patience, and in understanding. Gloria didn't need anyone to acknowledge her struggle. She didn't need applause or validation. She had lived long enough to know that true peace came not from external recognition, but from internal fulfillment. And tonight, she had fulfilled something far greater than any courtroom verdict or public recognition ever could. She had made someone see the world differently, and that was the kind of change that could ripple outward, slowly, quietly, over time. As the miles ticked by, her thoughts began to slow, and the tension that had initially gripped her faded away completely. She thought about the officer, his face, the way he had faltered, the humility that had overtaken him when he realized who she was. He wasn't a bad person. He was just a product of a system that had taught him to make judgments based on what he could see and not who someone truly was. But tonight, that system had cracked. It had shown him that assumptions didn't always lead to the truth. And sometimes, the truth had a way of showing up when you least expected it. As she neared her home, the familiar lights of her small house coming into view, Gloria smiled quietly to herself. There was no fanfare, no celebration, just the soft glow of a single light in her window, the comfort of her own space waiting for her. The officer would be all right. He would do better. And that was enough. She turned onto her street, slowing as she approached her driveway. The night had been long, but it had been worth it. The world might not change in an instant, but moments like this had the power to shift someone's perspective. And that, in itself, was a victory. As Gloria pulled into her driveway and put the car in park, she sat for a moment, taking in the quiet. There was no more need for words, no more need for explanations. She had spoken, and the officer had listened. The rest was up to him. The world, for a brief moment, was as it should be.